The night was unusually quiet for the kingdom of Lysoria, nestled between vast mountain ranges and dark, sprawling forests. A light breeze blew through the capital city, carrying with it a faint scent of lavender and damp stone. The full moon cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets, illuminating the royal palace perched atop the highest hill. Its towering spires reached toward the heavens, glowing silver in the moonlight, as though guarding secrets within its walls. Princess Anastasia, heir to the throne, stood by her chamber window, her hands gripping the cold stone ledge. She could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. At 17, she was soon to be crowned queen, but something about it felt wrong. Her father, King Lysander, had fallen gravely ill a month ago. No physician in the land could determine the cause of his mysterious ailment, and his condition only worsened by the day. The court whispered of a curse. They spoke in hushed tones, when they thought no one was listening, about the king's reckless pursuit of ancient knowledge, long-lost texts and artifacts buried in forgotten tombs. Some believed he had disturbed powers that should have remained untouched. Anastasia wasn't sure what to believe, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her father's illness had something to do with the ancient texts he had been studying before he fell ill. Suddenly, a light knock sounded at her door, jolting her from her thoughts. "Come in," Anastasia called, her voice trembling slightly. She turned from the window as the door creaked open, revealing her closest confidant and maid, Alara. "My lady," Alara said softly, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "The council is meeting tonight. They are discussing the succession." Anastasia's stomach twisted. She had been dreading this moment. The council wanted her coronation to take place immediately, before her father's condition worsened beyond recovery. The kingdom couldn't afford to be without a leader, they said. But Anastasia wasn't ready. Not when there were so many questions unanswered, and the darkness surrounding her father's illness still loomed over them all. "They expect me to take the crown," Anastasia whispered, pacing the length of her room. "But how can I lead when I don't know what's happening to my fathers?" Alara hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "There may be another way, Your Highness." Anastasia stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat. Alara had a look in her eyes, something secretive, something dangerous. "What do you mean?" Alara glanced toward the door, as if ensuring no one else was listening, then lowered her voice to a near whisper. "There's an old legend, a tale told by my grandmother when I was a child. She spoke of an ancient hidden crown, a crown that was said to hold unimaginable power, but at a terrible cost. It was hidden deep within the Blackwood Forest, guarded by forces that no mortal should ever face." Anastasia's blood ran cold. The Blackwood Forest was a place no one dared venture. It was said to be haunted, cursed. Those who entered never returned. "Are you suggesting I go there?" she asked, incredulous. "To find this crown?" "If the legends are true," Alara said, her voice steady but urgent, "the crown may be the only thing that can save your father. But be warned, princess.
It is not a simple task.
The crown is said to be cursed, its power linked to the darkest of magics. It may save the king, but it could also bring unimaginable danger to you and the kingdom." Anastasia's heart pounded in her chest. The idea was madness. But the thought of losing her father, of being crowned queen without him by her side, was unbearable. She couldn't just sit here and wait for him to die, not if there was even the slightest chance that she could save him. "I'll do it," Anastasia said, her voice firm with determination. "Tell me what I need to know." Alara nodded gravely. "I will prepare everything, but we must leave tonight. The council cannot know of this. They would never allow it." As Alara slipped out of the room to make the necessary preparations, Anastasia's mind raced. The weight of her decision pressed heavily on her shoulders. What if the legends were just that? Stories, nothing more. What if the crown didn't exist? Or worse, what if it did, and its power was more dangerous than they could imagine? But she had to try. She couldn't let her father die without doing everything in her power to save him. As she dressed in her traveling clothes, a dark cloak fastened tightly around her shoulders, Anastasia glanced back at the palace one last time. The towering spires, once so comforting, now felt like prison bars keeping her trapped in a fate she wasn't ready to face. "Alara," she whispered under her breath, "I hope you're right." The two women slipped into the night, disappearing into the shadows as they made their way toward the edge of the kingdom. The Blackwood Forest awaited, its ancient trees looming in the distance like silent sentinels. And with every step Anastasia took, the sense of foreboding grew stronger. She knew, deep in her heart, that this journey would change everything. But she didn't know how much danger truly awaited her in the darkness ahead. The path leading to the Blackwood Forest was seldom used, overgrown with vines and roots that seemed to reach out like twisted hands from the earth. The closer Anastasia and Alara drew to the forest's edge, the thicker the air became, heavy with an unnatural stillness. No wind stirred the leaves, no animals scurried through the underbrush. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. "Do you feel that?" Anastasia whispered, her voice barely louder than the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. Alara nodded, her face pale but resolute. "It's the forest. People say it's alive, watching, waiting for those brave or foolish enough to enter." Anastasia swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. The stories she'd heard growing up painted the Blackwood as a place of nightmares, where the trees whispered secrets and the shadows moved with a will of their own. Few who ventured inside were ever seen again. But those were just stories, weren't they? "We have to keep moving," Anastasia said, more to convince herself than Alara. "We don't have time to be afraid." Alara didn't reply, but her grip tightened on the hilt of the dagger at her side. They pushed forward, stepping into the thick shadows of the forest. As soon as they crossed the threshold, it felt as if a wall had closed behind them, shutting them off from the world they knew. The forest was suffocatingly quiet. No sound of birds, no rustling of branches in the wind, just an eerie, oppressive silence. The oppressive silence of the Blackwood weighed on Anastasia's chest like a heavy blanket. Each step they took into the forest felt as though they were descending deeper into another world, a place where light and sound barely existed. The tall trees, gnarled and ancient, seemed to close in around them, their twisted branches weaving a canopy so thick that the moonlight struggled to penetrate. Only faint silver rays filtered down, casting ghostly patterns on the forest floor. Anastasia tightened her grip on the hilt of the sword strapped to her side. It was a ceremonial blade, more for show than for actual combat, but it offered some comfort. Alara walked beside her, silent but alert, her eyes scanning the shadows as if expecting something, anything, to emerge. "How far do we have to go?" Anastasia whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness. Alara pulled a worn, yellowed map from her satchel, glancing at it briefly before tucking it back. "The heart of the forest. That's where the crown is said to be hidden, within an ancient, forgotten temple." Anastasia nodded, though the mention of the temple only heightened her unease. According to legend, the temple was older than the kingdom itself, built by a civilization long lost to time. The crown had been sealed away there for a reason. But now, desperate times called for desperate measures. As they ventured deeper, a faint mist began to rise from the ground, swirling around their ankles. The temperature dropped, the air growing colder with each step. Anastasia shivered, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders. The mist thickened, creeping higher until it seemed to obscure the very path they were on. "Alara, is this normal?" Anastasia asked, glancing around nervously. Alara's face was pale, her brow furrowed. "I don't know, Your Highness. The stories never mention this." Suddenly, a faint rustling sound broke the silence, coming from the trees behind them. Anastasia froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Alara spun around, dagger in hand, eyes scanning the darkness. The sound was faint at first, barely distinguishable from the shifting of the mist, but it grew louder, a shuffling, scraping noise, as if something was moving through the underbrush. Anastasia's blood ran cold. What was that? Before Alara could answer, the rustling grew louder, closer. The mist parted, revealing a dark shape slithering between the trees, a shadowy, serpentine figure that seemed to glide effortlessly across the ground. Anastasia's breath caught in her throat. The creature, whatever it was, moved with unnatural grace, its long, sinuous body blending with the mist. It had no discernible form, just a mass of shifting darkness that seemed to ripple and writhe as it moved. "Elara," Anastasia whispered urgently, stepping back. "I see it," Elara replied, her voice steady but low. "Stay behind me, Your Highness." Anastasia's hand instinctively went to the hilt of her sword, but she hesitated. Would a simple blade even work against something like that? The shadow creature drew closer, its presence oppressive, almost suffocating. The air around them seemed to grow even colder, and Anastasia could feel an overwhelming sense of dread settle over her. For a moment, the creature paused, its formless body hovering just at the edge of the mist. Then, without warning, it surged forward. "Elara!" Anastasia cried, her voice echoing through the forest as Elara lunged forward, her dagger slicing through the air. But the blade passed through the creature, as if it were made of smoke. The shadow recoiled, twisting away from the dagger, but it wasn't retreating, it was regrouping. "We need to move," Elara shouted, grabbing Anastasia's arm.
"Now."
Without waiting for a response, Elara pulled her away from the creature, and they ran. The forest blurred around them as they sprinted through the mist, their footsteps pounding against the earth. Anastasia's breath came in ragged gasps, her heart racing as they fled deeper into the blackwood. Behind them, she could hear the creature following, its rustling, slithering sound growing louder as it closed the distance. They darted between trees, dodging low-hanging branches and twisted roots. The mist thickened around them, making it harder to see, but they didn't stop. Anastasia's legs burned from the effort, but adrenaline pushed her forward. She could hear Elara's labored breathing beside her, but neither of them dared to slow down. Suddenly, the ground beneath Anastasia's feet shifted, and she stumbled, her foot catching on something solid. She barely managed to catch herself before tumbling headlong into the mist. Glancing down, she saw the edge of a stone structure peeking through the underbrush, a crumbling, moss-covered wall. "Elara, look," Anastasia called, pointing toward the stone. Elara skidded to a halt beside her, eyes wide with realization. The temple. The creature's hissing grew louder behind them, and there was no time to hesitate. Without another word, the two of them scrambled over the broken wall, disappearing into the ruins of the ancient temple. The interior was dark and cold, the air thick with the smell of damp stone and decay. Anastasia's heart pounded in her chest as they crouched behind a large pillar, catching their breath. The shadow creature hovered outside the entrance, its shape shifting and writhing as it circled the ruins. But it didn't enter. "It won't come inside," Elara whispered, her voice barely audible. Anastasia stared at the creature, her mind racing.
"Why?"
"I don't know," Elara said, shaking her head. "But something inside this temple is keeping it at bay." The creature lingered for a moment longer, then slowly retreated into the mist, disappearing as silently as it had come. Anastasia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her body trembling from the adrenaline. "We're safe," Elara said, though her voice was filled with uncertainty.
"For now."
Anastasia glanced around the dark, crumbling interior of the temple. The walls were etched with strange symbols, worn smooth by time, and the floor was littered with debris. But there, in the center of the room, stood a stone pedestal, and atop it rested a small, intricately carved chest. "Elara," Anastasia breathed, her eyes locked on the chest. "The crown." But as they approached the pedestal, the air around them seemed to shift. The temperature dropped even further, and a deep, resonant hum filled the chamber, vibrating through the stone. Anastasia felt a chill crawl up her spine, and she instinctively reached for her sword. Something was very wrong. "Elara," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I think we're not alone in here." Before Elara could respond, the shadows in the room began to move. The shadows in the temple began to twist and writhe as if alive, moving like tendrils of smoke along the walls and floor. Anastasia's heart pounded as she watched, her hand instinctively tightening around the hilt of her sword. The air grew thick, the ancient symbols carved into the stone walls seeming to pulse with a faint, eerie glow. "Alara," Anastasia whispered, barely able to control the tremble in her voice. "What's happening?" Alara's eyes were wide with fear, her dagger held tightly in her hand. She took a cautious step forward, her gaze darting between the swirling shadows and the chest atop the pedestal. "I don't know, but something is waking." The resonant hum that had filled the room moments before grew louder, vibrating through the air like a warning. The temperature plummeted further, cold enough to make Anastasia's breath visible. The mist that had clung to their ankles outside the temple now crept into the chamber, swirling around their feet like a living thing. A voice, soft and low, almost a whisper, echoed through the chamber. Anastasia froze, her eyes darting around the room, but she saw no one. The voice was everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the very walls of the temple had spoken. Alara stepped closer to Anastasia, her face pale but determined. "It's the temple's guardian," she whispered. "I've heard stories about places like this, places of great power. They're often protected by ancient spirits, bound to guard what lies within." Anastasia swallowed hard, her heart racing in her chest. "What do we do?" A voice, soft and low, almost a whisper, echoed through the chamber. Anastasia froze, her eyes darting around the room, but she saw no one. The voice was everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the very walls of the temple had spoken. Alara stepped closer to Anastasia, her face pale but determined. "It's the temple's guardian," she whispered. "I've heard stories about places like this, places of great power. They're often protected by ancient spirits, bound to guard what lies within." Anastasia swallowed hard, her heart racing in her chest. "What do we do?" Before Alara could answer, the shadows on the walls began to coalesce, forming into vaguely humanoid shapes. Dark, formless figures stepped out of the walls, their bodies made of shifting black mist. They had no faces, no features, just hollow voids where their eyes should have been. Anastasia's grip tightened on her sword, though the cold metal in her hand felt like little comfort. "We're not alone," she whispered, backing toward the center of the room, her eyes locked on the figures that now surrounded them. Alara followed, her dagger raised defensively. "These are the spirits bound to the temple," she said, her voice barely audible. "They won't let us leave without a price." The shadowy figures circled them slowly, their movements unnervingly smooth, as though they floated above the ground. They made no sound, but their presence was suffocating, an overwhelming sense of dread filling the room. The voice echoed again, more menacing this time. Anastasia's breath caught in her throat. The legends of the Crown of Shadows had warned of its dark power, a power that came at a terrible price. But they hadn't come all this way for nothing. Her father's life depended on that crown, and she couldn't turn back now, not when they were so close. "We have no choice," Anastasia whispered, glancing at Alara. "We need that crown." Alara nodded, though her expression was grim. "But we have to be careful. The crown may save your father, but its power is dangerous. We don't know what it could do to you." Anastasia hesitated, her gaze flicking to the chest atop the pedestal. The hum in the air grew louder as she approached, and the shadows seemed to press in closer, as if watching her every move. The pedestal was covered in ancient, faded symbols, the language of a forgotten people. The chest itself was small, made of dark wood, and intricately carved with swirling designs that glowed faintly in the dim light. It looked fragile, as though it had been undisturbed for centuries. "Alara, if something happens, if this goes wrong," Anastasia began, her voice trembling. Alara stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on her arm. "You're not alone, Anastasia. Whatever happens, we face it together." Taking a deep breath, Anastasia reached out and placed her hands on the chest. The moment her fingers touched the cool wood, the air around them shifted violently. A gust of wind, impossibly strong for an enclosed chamber, whipped through the temple, extinguishing the faint light of their torches. The temperature dropped even further, the cold biting into her skin. The shadows surged forward, their hollow eyes glowing faintly as they closed in on Anastasia and Alara. Anastasia's heart raced, panic rising in her chest. The voice echoed again, louder, filled with a dark, ancient power. Anastasia swallowed, her fingers trembling as she lifted the lid of the chest. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, lay the crown. It was unlike anything she had imagined, made of black metal that shimmered like oil in the dim light, its surface adorned with jagged, twisted spikes. The crown seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it were breathing. Anastasia's hand hovered over the crown, her mind racing with doubts. What if this was a mistake? What if the crown's power was too much for her to control? But the image of her father, weak and dying in his bed, flashed through her mind. She had come this far. She couldn't stop now. "I have to do this," she whispered, more to herself than to Alara. Without another word, she lifted the crown from the chest. The moment her fingers closed around the cold metal, the temple erupted with a blinding light. The shadows shrieked, their forms dissolving into the mist as the light consumed the chamber. Anastasia cried out as a surge of power shot through her body, overwhelming her senses. It was like nothing she had ever felt, cold and dark, yet intoxicating and irresistible. The crown pulsed in her hands, and for a brief moment, she could feel it, the power, flowing through her veins. The shadows seemed to whisper to her, their voices merging with the ancient hum of the temple. Alara's voice cut through the chaos, distant and strained. "Anastasia, put it down. The crown is too dangerous." But Anastasia couldn't move. She was frozen, her mind caught in a whirlwind of darkness and light. The crown whispered to her, calling her, tempting her with promises of unimaginable power. All she had to do was place it on her head. In that moment, Anastasia knew, if she claimed the crown, there would be no turning back. Its power would be hers, but so too would its curse. The question was, could she live with the consequences? Her hand trembled as she lifted the crown toward her head. And then, in the blinding light, everything went dark. When Anastasia woke, she was lying on cold, damp stone. The world around her was a blur of shadows and indistinct shapes, and her head throbbed as if it had been split in two. She blinked, trying to focus, the fog in her mind slowly lifting. The air was still heavy, and a sharp chill clung to her skin. She sat up slowly, her limbs feeling weak and unsteady. The temple was silent, save for the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness. The pedestal, the chest, and the crown. It all came rushing back to her in a wave of memories. She gasped, her hand flying to her head. But the crown wasn't there. "Alara," she croaked, her voice barely more than a whisper. A faint groan came from her left, and she turned to see Alara slumped against a nearby wall, her hand clutching her head. Relief surged through Anastasia as she crawled toward her. "Alara, are you all right?" Alara blinked, then nodded weakly as she sat up. "I think so. What happened?" Anastasia glanced around the temple, her mind racing. The crown had surged with power, dark, overwhelming power, but then everything had gone black. She had no idea how long they'd been unconscious, or what had happened while they were out. "The crown," Anastasia murmured, her eyes darting to the pedestal. It was empty. The chest was gone, as if it had never been there at all. Alara followed her gaze, her face paling. "Where is it? Did you put it on?" "I don't know," Anastasia admitted, her voice trembling. "I felt its power, it was too much. But I didn't put it on." "I don't think I did." Alara's eyes narrowed with concern. "You touched it, though. That might have been enough." Anastasia's heart sank. She had touched the crown, had felt the surge of darkness flow through her. But now, there was no trace of it, no sign that it had ever been in the temple. She reached up and touched her head again, just to be sure, but her fingers met only her tangled hair. "We have to leave this place," Alara said, her voice steady but urgent. "Whatever power was in that crown, it's still here. I can feel it." Anastasia nodded. She could feel it too, an oppressive weight, lingering in the air, as if the temple itself was watching them. Without another word, they scrambled to their feet, their backslash. Without another word, they scrambled to their feet, their bodies still weak, but driven by the need to escape. Together, they made their way toward the entrance of the temple, but as they stepped out of the main chamber and into the crumbling corridor, Anastasia felt something shift inside her. A wave of dizziness hit her, and she staggered, grabbing the wall for support. "Alara," she gasped, her vision blurring. Alara turned, her eyes wide with alarm. "Anastasia? What's wrong?" Anastasia opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, a sharp, stabbing pain shot through her chest, as though something was clawing its way up from within. She doubled over, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Alara," she cried out, her voice cracking with fear. Something's happening." Alara rushed to her side, but before she could reach her, a strange light began to pulse from Anastasia's skin, dark, shadowy tendrils of energy that wrapped around her like vines. The same dark power that she had felt in the crown was now coursing through her veins, trying to take hold. "Alara," she cried again, but this time her voice sounded distant, even to her own ears. The world around her was slipping away, and in its place, there was only darkness. Cold, suffocating darkness. Anastasia collapsed to the ground, her body convulsing as the dark magic surged through her. She could feel it, deep inside, like a parasite feeding on her very soul. It was the curse of the crown, binding itself to her whether she wanted it or not. She had touched it, and now it was claiming her. Alara knelt beside her, panic etched on her face. "Anastasia, hold on. You can fight this." But Anastasia wasn't sure she could. The darkness was too strong, too overwhelming. It was like drowning in an endless sea, the weight of it pulling her deeper and deeper into the abyss. She could hear voices, whispers in a language she didn't understand, voices that echoed in her mind, telling her to surrender, to let go. The voices whispered. Anastasia squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the voices, trying to fight the pull of the dark magic. But it was relentless, tightening its grip on her with every passing second. "No," she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. "I won't let you take me." But the voices only laughed, their cold, cruel laughter echoing in her mind. Alara grabbed Anastasia's hand, her grip firm and unyielding. "Fight it, Anastasia. You have to fight it. Don't let the darkness take you." Anastasia clung to Alara's voice like a lifeline, trying to focus on the sound of her friend, trying to hold on to the last shred of herself that hadn't been consumed by the shadows. But it was getting harder. She could feel the darkness inside her, twisting and corrupting, changing her from the inside out. Suddenly, the pulsing energy around Anastasia flared, and for a brief moment, her vision cleared. The shadows that had wrapped themselves around her began to fade, retreating like smoke on the wind. She could breathe again. But then, just as suddenly as the darkness had receded, it surged back with a vengeance. Anastasia screamed as the pain returned, sharper than before, and her body was engulfed in shadow once more. The voices, the cold laughter, they were back, louder and more insistent. Anastasia's vision blurred, her grip on reality slipping away. She was losing. The darkness was winning, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But then, through the haze of pain and shadows, she heard a different voice, faint, but familiar. It wasn't Alara. It was deeper, stronger, and it cut through the chaos like a beacon of light. Anastasia's heart skipped a beat. She knew that voice. "Father," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The voice came again, clearer this time, her father's voice. Was it real? Or was it just another trick of the darkness? Anastasia didn't know, but in that moment, she clung to it with everything she had. "I will fight," she whispered, her voice gaining strength. "I won't let it take me." Summoning every ounce of willpower she had left, Anastasia pushed against the darkness, forcing it back. The shadows writhed and twisted around her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. This was her fight, and she was not going to lose. The voices screamed in her mind, furious and desperate, but she blocked them out. Slowly, painfully, the darkness began to recede. The shadowy tendrils that had wrapped around her body dissolved into nothingness, and the cold, suffocating presence inside her faded. With a final, agonizing cry, Anastasia broke free from the darkness. She collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, her body trembling from the effort. The temple was silent again, the shadows gone. The curse had retreated, but not entirely. She could still feel its presence, lingering just beneath the surface. "Alara?" Anastasia croaked, her voice weak. Alara was beside her in an instant, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with relief. "You fought it off." Anastasia nodded, though she wasn't sure how long she could keep the darkness at bay. The crown's power was still inside her, waiting, watching. She had resisted it this time, but she knew the fight was far from over. And now, a new fear took hold of her heart. She had come to the Blackwood Forest to save her father. But what if the curse was already stronger than the cure? Anastasia sat in the ruins of the temple, her body trembling as the last echoes of the dark power faded. The oppressive cold that had gripped her moments ago was replaced by a hollow, unsettling silence. The curse was not gone, just subdued, lurking in the depths of her soul, waiting for another chance to take hold. Alara knelt beside her, her face pale and drawn. "We need to get you out of here," she whispered, her voice tinged with fear. "That power, it's dangerous, Anastasia. I don't know how long you can resist it." Anastasia nodded weakly, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She could still hear her father's voice, soft but resolute, telling her to fight, to resist the crown's pull. The memory of his words had given her the strength to push the darkness away, but the struggle had left her drained, both physically and mentally. Her father was dying, and she had come all this way to save him. Yet now, with the crown's curse threatening to consume her, she was beginning to doubt whether she could fulfill her mission without succumbing to its power. Was she strong enough to wield the crown of shadows without losing herself? "Alara," she said softly, her voice hoarse. "I have to save my father. But if the crown's curse takes me before I can do that," she trailed off, her heart heavy with uncertainty. Alara's expression softened, but there was a steely determination in her eyes. "We'll find another way. There has to be something else, someone else who can help us lift the curse. We won't let this darkness win." Anastasia wished she could believe Alara's words, but the weight of the crown's power still pressed against her mind like a cold, heavy hand. It whispered to her in the quiet moments, tempting her with visions of immense power and control. The curse wasn't just a dark force, it was insidious, working its way into her thoughts and emotions, trying to twist her into something she didn't recognize. "We should leave," Alara urged, glancing nervously toward the temple's entrance. "This place that feels wrong, like it's watching us. The longer we stay here, the more danger you're in." Anastasia nodded and rose to her feet, though her legs wobbled beneath her. Alara reached out to steady her, and together they began to make their way back toward the exit of the ancient temple. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the once grand architecture now felt like the crumbling remnants of a long-forgotten tomb. It was as if the very temple itself resented their presence, disturbed by the intrusion of living souls. As they stepped out into the open air, the oppressive weight of the temple lifted slightly, but Anastasia couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. The mist that had settled in the forest swirled around them like a living thing, cold and damp against their skin. The Blackwood Forest was as eerie as ever, the towering trees stretching upward like skeletal hands against the darkening sky. The sense of foreboding that had been with them since they'd first entered the forest now seemed to intensify, as if the entire forest was aware of what had transpired inside the temple. "We should keep moving," Alara said, her voice low. "The sooner we get back to the village, the better." Anastasia nodded, but as they began to walk, something gnawed at her, a sense of impending doom, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the shadows from the temple following them, but there was nothing. Just the thick mist and the dense trees. The journey back to the village was slow and difficult. Anastasia's body ached from the strain of fighting the curse, and every step felt like a monumental effort. The forest seemed more hostile now, with the rustling of leaves and the snapping of branches sounding unnervingly loud in the silence. After what felt like hours of walking, they finally saw the faint glow of the village's lanterns in the distance. Relief washed over Anastasia, but it was short-lived. As they approached the village gates, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the forest. Anastasia and Alara froze, their eyes scanning the trees around them. The sound grew louder, like the growl of some great, unseen beast, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Anastasia's heart pounded in her chest. Whatever it was getting closer. Suddenly, from the shadows of the forest, a massive, dark figure emerged, a creature unlike anything Anastasia had ever seen. Its body was twisted and grotesque, with sharp, jagged spikes protruding from its back. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural, malevolent light, and its mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth. Anastasia's blood ran cold. The creature seemed to be made of the same dark energy that had filled the temple, shadowy, shifting, and dangerous. It was as if the curse had taken physical form, and it was coming for her. "Alara, run!" Anastasia shouted, pushing her friend toward the village gates. But Alara didn't move. She stood her ground, her dagger in hand, her eyes locked on the creature. "I'm not leaving you." The creature let out a deafening roar and charged toward them, its massive claws digging into the earth as it moved with terrifying speed. Anastasia's heart raced, and without thinking, she raised her hand toward the creature, instinctively summoning the dark power that had taken root inside her. The shadows responded instantly. Dark tendrils of energy shot out from her hand, wrapping around the creature and pulling it to a halt. The power surged through her, cold and intoxicating, filling her with a sense of control she had never felt before. For a moment, the darkness wasn't her enemy. It was her weapon. The creature writhed and snarled, struggling against the shadowy bonds, but Anastasia's grip tightened. The more she fed into the power, the stronger the shadows became, and the creature began to weaken under the pressure. But even as she fought, a small voice in the back of her mind warned her that she was walking a dangerous line. "Alara," Anastasia gasped, her voice strained. "Get to the village. I'll hold it off." "No," Alara shouted, refusing to leave her side. "You can't fight this thing alone." But Anastasia didn't have time to argue. The darkness within her was growing stronger, more insistent, and she could feel the pull of the curse trying to take over again. She couldn't let that happen. With a final surge of power, Anastasia sent a wave of shadows crashing into the creature, knocking it back into the trees. It roared in pain, but before it could recover, Anastasia turned and ran, grabbing Alara's arm and pulling her toward the village gates. They sprinted toward safety, the sounds of the creature's roars fading behind them. But even as they reached the village and the gates slammed shut behind them, Anastasia couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The curse of the crown had taken root inside her, and now it had manifested in the form of a monstrous creature. She had fought it off this time, but the darkness was growing stronger. The whispers of the shadows echoed in her mind, tempting her with promises of power, and she knew that the next time it came for her, it might be too late to resist. Anastasia collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. Alara knelt beside her, her face pale but determined. "We'll figure this out," Alara said softly. "We'll find a way to break the curse. But you can't do this alone." Anastasia nodded, though doubt gnawed at her. The power of the Crown of Shadows was unlike anything she had ever encountered, and now it was a part of her. She had come to the Blackwood Forest to save her father, but now she wondered if the Crown's curse would claim her before she ever had the chance.